So let's start off with the kind of first agenda point that we touched on, which is that kind of seismic shift in the R&D landscape, and how can tech companies manage some of those risks. So Mark, before we even get into like some of these shifts and changes, like I think let's peel it back a little bit. What's driving these behaviors? What is it at HMRC that's making those changes, and why are we seeing that at the moment? Because if we understand almost the psychology of the changes, then we can really get under the skin of like what's going on behind the scenes here.
It does, and I think it links as a thread all the way through to some of the points we'll touch on about where things are going and what they're doing with the regimes. Yeah, again, I suspect a lot of people on the call will know some of this or potentially all of it, so I'll keep it succinct. But there's been, I guess the first point is what you touched on a couple of minutes ago, that for 10 years or so, HMRC haven't changed that much with the regimes. They brought the RDEC regime came in 2013 to 2016. There's been changes consumable rules and things like that over the past few years, but by and large, just not a huge amount has changed. And so one of the things that's resulted in is the regimes not quite being fit for purpose and haven't kind of kept pace with some of the changes. And we can get into some of the examples around that, particularly for the audience. So that's one element of it. Some of the changes coming in now is basically a good 10 years of backed up changes, that some of which should have come in probably a while back, under the just keeping it modern and fit for purpose, and hasn't. The other key one though really is that they haven't policed the regimes correctly for the last, again, 8 to 10 years. And this is probably, again, not a surprise to anyone on the call, right? For a long time, HMRC didn't have enough inspectors. The R&D regimes grew significantly in terms of volume of claimants, and this then coupled with seeing a lot of bad claims coming into the marketplace, and even some less than whiter than white advisors, let's put it that way, coming into the marketplace as well, helping people claim who should never have been claiming. And then there's two things here to delineate, right? There's been claims that are without question fraud, right? And again, people on the call have seen this on LinkedIn and even in some of the Times Online and stuff. Things like pubs claiming for making a menu that's healthier than the menu they had in the pub last year and claiming that as R&D tactic, which is just like anyone can tell, right? That's utter nonsense. Care homes claiming for like re-landscaping a garden, stuff like that, like utter nonsense. So that fraud has been a big driver for a lot of the changes now and the scrutiny that we'll come into. But I think even than that, I think one of the things that we need to get into a bit here is some of the other changes we'll touch on. They are moving the goalposts. So even with stuff that was probably just about genuinely claimable in the past, HMRC are narrowing what qualifies, simply put. So we can get into that a little bit because that's particularly relevant. So it's those have been the main two drivers. It's been around not policing it properly. Yeah. So now they've started policing it properly. Yeah. Not modernising it when they should have. So a bunch of the changes under that modernisation banner.
And I guess one of those points about not policing it correctly is, again, if we just dial that back for a second, it's because I'm just going to call it. There's a lot of let's just refer to them as the boutiques, right? And the boutiques are only providing R&D services quite often, not other services. Usually, and from their perspective, it's fundamentally a volume play for these businesses. Yeah. So they're well aware of the fact that, for instance, if they put in 10 claims, they know that a number of them will fall out the mix because it won't pass muster. But from their perspective, if they just churn as many as they can through, the thought process there is that, some will pass through, or HMRC will be too busy because the inspectors haven't had the time and attention and detail. But that's all come to an end now, hasn't it?
Well, yeah, and this is why it snowballed exactly that. Again, HMRC would never openly admit this, but there was rumours that, in theory, anything under a couple of £100,000 would qualify on expenditure, particularly, they weren't looking at because they didn't have the bandwidth. So they used to have somewhere around about 80 odd R&D inspectors, and they've got 280 odd. So that's obviously one of the big changes that's come in, and hence why there's a massive increase in inquiries and things like that. So they didn't have the bandwidth. So these claims would go in, they get through, they get paid out, not because they were right, but because nobody was looking at them. And then the claimant thought, okay, well, this is fine, and the boutique's taken a cut, and everyone was happy, but it was never good. It was never compliant, and then it's just building up.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Chris has already dropped a note in, which I love, by the way. Chris has said, is it all doom and gloom? I assume you're still getting a large percentage of claims going through without any challenge.
Yeah, oh, hi, Chris.
I'm happy to share my experience if you want as well.
Yeah, no, go for it.
Yeah, go.
Right. So in the last 3 years, we've submitted average repayments of 770k.
Yeah.
And our average repayment time has been 31 days.
Yeah.
So even in the last year, I submitted on the 4th of July and my repayment was in on the 2nd of August.
Cool.
And I accept that I've heard all these things, but you must be seeing positive cases as well.
Oh yeah, exactly. Well, I think we've met before, haven't we, Chris?
Yeah, we met in Birmingham.
Yeah, I recognise it. Yeah, but no, it is. It isn't all doom and gloom, but it's certainly a massive shift from where HMRC were 18 months back. I mean, we see it. We used to get about one inquiry a year, and we've got a few hundred, several hundred clients, but that's up on our side to 20, 25 or something. So ours has gone up a lot.
Yeah.
There's others we know of in the marketplace. I think it was in the Times Online the other week about RDI Solutions, who are one of the larger R&D boutiques who've exited the market with all the changes that are going on. There was the National Audit Office report about tax measures to encourage economic activity back in January, which obviously covers a number of areas, but there was a good bit about R&D in that. And that was, I mean, some of the numbers in there were staggering, that in the 2020-21 tax year, that was showing that HMRC had found almost 25%, almost a quarter of all the claims, well, a quarter of the value claimed, which equates to about £1 billion, had error or fraud. So the scale of that is pretty staggering. But yeah, you're absolutely right, Chris. There's still plenty of genuine claimants, even with we'll get into the narrowing piece that I'm seeing as well, but there's still plenty of genuine claimants out there and people claiming absolutely fine. I think the key point, one of the key overall points of all this that we get through, is there's so many changes. As long as you're following all the latest guidance, following all the latest rules, and doing the new forms and all these different pieces that you've got to do these days, then you should be all right. But I think a lot of people are struggling to keep pace with the rate of the change.
I think it's important to remember what the scheme's all about as well, because that at the heart of what R&D is about incentivizing businesses to develop and to retain here in the UK, developing proprietary technology, right? That's what's driving this. Yeah. So when businesses are actually actively doing that, we can definitely see that it's to take the opposite of what Chris has said, that when companies are actively pursuing that engagement to drive future development in science and technology, you still fall within the regime. It's that the problem that you've got is that the inquiries and the number of inquiries, there's so much noise around that at the moment that kind of can be a bit unsettling for a lot of businesses. And also just being aware that there have just been so many inquiries for frankly, as Mark said, just fringe fraudulent areas that should never have been included. So there is a lot more scrutiny. Let's get into that a bit more detail. So yeah. Mark, like what are the key changes that companies need to be aware of?
Yeah, there's a lot. And we won't be able to cover all of it. So I think everyone's probably on the call well aware of the additional information form that came out in August last year that everyone's got to submit now to have a genuine claim. So I'm not going to go through that. HMRC have been making some changes to that form, and I think there'll be more changes in the future, but that I won't touch on. I think linked to this key point that we're talking about, James, I think it's worth touching on the guidelines for compliance that HMRC released in November. So this was basically, it was pretty extensive, a raft of guidance that came out in November last year. And it was in effect the kind of accumulation of, I think, what they've been learning and seeing with the increase in inquiries, and as they brought these extra 200 or so inspectors on the ground over the last year or 18 months. And it was them summarising that. And as always, I think, they're trying to approach it from a perspective of what we're seeing is a number of people not quite claiming as we quite like them to claim. Here's some guidance to help people. And again, it comes back to the point again, their guidance by and large hadn't had many updates for quite a long time. And there was a lot in that guidance, but there was particularly a lot around projects, how you take the R&D tax definition and apply it to the projects in your business, and particularly things around the boundaries of R&D, where you're identifying the R&D to start and stop. Obviously, that then flows into who's involved in the R&D in your business, what costs you can claim, and so forth. So there's quite a lot around that. There's quite a lot around the competent professional as well. And I think this was where HMRC had seen perhaps quite a lot of claims where the person at the company judging where the R&D is and how much R&D there's been was in some instances not really a competent professional. And again, they don't give you a black and white definition of the competent professional, and you can see they're at pains not to say you've got to have certain qualification levels or you must have this degree or something. It's not as black and white as that, but it's making sure they are basically an expert in the science or the particular technology at hand for the claim at hand. So the project point is key, because we're seeing this with our clients as well. It's not wholesale change, but I think for a lot of claimants, it's probably moved the goalposts a bit, and it's making sure whatever you start claiming now for your next claim, you need to be factoring in that guidance from November. And I think to use software and touch on software, which is probably particularly relevant for a lot of the call. I think the key here again, and they go through this again, it's getting down to the detail of the software. And I've got to be honest, this hasn't really changed from the 2018 guidance that came out around claiming software that came off the back of HMRC using software experts internally to help review claims. But I think it's just got even more prominence now because they've got more people looking at claims. But the best thing I can say for people probably on this call is making sure you're getting down into the detail of the software you're developing. You know, telling HMRC we've developed this new platform that's disrupting this industry in this way, and clearly advancing things perhaps to use HMRC's kind of language they use at a business level, they don't give a crap about. And I've been on calls where they've been as blunt as that with some language. Like, what they want is you're looking for the advances and the uncertainties and the baseline and all that good stuff down in the software. Yeah. And what I normally say to clients is start thinking of that almost down at the library level, the software library, almost the code line level. That's where we need to be. It's not enough to say we've built this unique platform and we did out of some .NET Microsoft stack or something. You've got to get much more specific than that.
We see that all the time, and when we're looking and scrutinizing that claims. So obviously we're in an interesting situation where we're looking at either from a diligence perspective or we're taking over claims from other providers. It's I always refer to it as the CEO drafting of an R&D claim, right? It's like they write it at such a high level, but it's to your point exactly, which is if you put it at this level, HMRC are just going to kick it out straight away, right? It's just like talking about the commercials of the business, commercials of the technology, are not going to get it there now. It's like you've got to get under the skin of it. Like, how deep do you need to go in terms of explaining that?
Well, I say that I always try and start with clients. Literally get me down to what's the software languages you've used? What's the software frameworks? What's the data? What's the whole stack? What's the database routines? Let's get down there. But literally, let's kind of it's always start with the baseline. What was there at the start when you start the project? At that level, what was there at the start? You know, what open source framework or language were you using, and what libraries or standards you get with that off the developer forums? It's literally getting down to that kind of level, and then say, okay, cool, right, that's where we're starting with. It's almost sort of, I don't think HMRC care that much what this then does at a business level and at a market level. Yeah. It's useful context, right? I think somewhere in your report, it's useful context, but not too much of it. That's where you start, and then you think about, well, how are we advancing that, and why was that uncertain? And then this is where it's key, bringing in this November guidance, in particular around the competent professional, who in the business is the technical expert. And sometimes it might not be the CTO, right? Again, it depends on the size and scale of your business. CTO might be a bit too removed. You might need the lead developer or someone like that who is really au fait with, I don't know, the particular .NET frameworks you're using and the specific database data or whatever Amazon Web Services you're consuming, whatever. Someone who's literally specific at that. It's not just enough you're an IT professional. It's you're experienced in these particular software languages and frameworks, and then working from that point around the advances and the uncertainties. Right. And this is it. And without getting onto the documentation side in the form, I don't think HMRC want chapter and verse. They don't need reams and reams of pages on this. If you're down at that level, the steer they've given is it can be pretty succinct and short and sweet. You've got to fill the boxes in these days on the form, but that's where you've got to describe it. And the key, what I always say to clients is, when you step back and look at any R&D claim, no matter what type it is, usually where's the risk? It's have we identified the projects and the boundaries correctly and all that good stuff? Have we identified them at the right kind of level in the technology? And have we described them well enough to HMRC so they understand it and can see the R&D? The cost side of a claim usually is more black and white. You've got to get two match up, right? Two have absolutely got to match up and sync. But the cost side is normally a bit more black and white. The projects is where the risk is. So that's where you want to focus.
Cool. I'm just conscious of time.
Yes.
One more question in this area. Are we expecting any more changes in terms of those kind of the shifts that we've just discussed? Are we or have we ridden the wave? Is it all over now? What do you think?
Well, so we'll come in a minute. We'll come a bit later to the merge regime that we know is coming for certain. At a slightly more speculative level, I don't think so. I think we'll see the volume of inquiries decrease and settle down as everyone understands where HMRC is shifting things to. It feels to me, when you put all this together in the big picture, I think HMRC are trying to get the regimes back to where they probably always should have been.
Yeah.
And it's never going to be as narrow as real true R&D or what the definitions called basic R&D, university level stuff, right? It's not getting it back to that, but it is getting it much more back to a truer sense of the R&D and a truer focus around the core product development and technology advancements. I think basically it's got away from them over the last decade or so, and this is all now bringing it back. And why I still think, the National Audit Office report talked about this, that HMRC themselves are still learning and they're still analysing what they're finding from all these inquiries. They're changing a lot of stuff very quickly, but I still don't think they fully understand exactly the full picture of what's emerging. And then you couple in things like in the budget, they haven't dropped any details on this yet, but the expert advisory committee that they referenced, and they talked about having representatives, particularly from life sciences and particularly from tech. My gut feel is that's just going to be the start. And I know there's other regimes around the world that use representatives, or I'm interpreting that as kind of experts, either from industry groups around tech and life sciences. The Irish regime sometimes uses academics. I don't know if we're going to go that far, but they're there to kind of help administer, direct, and help HMRC with managing the regimes going forward. And I'm interpreting that, and I might be wrong, I'm interpreting that as helping them keep it much more focused on the truer advances in any given industry, and helping them, HMRC, navigate how they make sure the R&D regimes get focused on those true innovations. So I this is it. It's completely changed, right? The landscape is completely changed, and I think this is where it will keep going. And so, will there be some other changes under that theme? I think there will. Exactly what they'll be, don't know. But I think that expert advisory committee is an interesting one.
Well, that accords as well, doesn't it? Because what we saw, and slightly back to Chris's point about the number of inquiries, we saw that in some instances, the HMRC opened up inquiries, almost blanket inquiries for specific sectors within the kind of tech ecosystem. So at times we saw, like e-commerce platforms, we saw just like inquiries just being opened up, almost generic inquiries being opened up in terms of the R&D. We saw it with a lot of ed techs as well. And they were really testing the validity of those platforms to ensure actually is what you're creating really driving those boundaries of technology, or actually you just taking a composite of off-the-shelf solutions and consuming them almost consolidating them together.
I think you're right. The term HMRC used in the budget was broad. I think broad. They said, so we see broad types or something, or broad areas of R&D within tech and within life science, which is why they're focusing on these two. I interpret that to mean they're seeing exactly as you're saying, whether it's ed tech, whether it's other type e-commerce, whether it's other types of platforms, and because tech's a broad banner, isn't it? and getting some of these representatives, whoever they might be, to help them. They said they'll reach out to people. They didn't want people reaching out, right? They've clearly got some ideas. But I think it is to help them navigate this, and how we all know tech moves so quick as well. So how do they keep on top of that, and how do they make sure the regimes are staying focused on rewarding, incentivizing the kind of R&D it should be?
Yeah. Right, let's move on to kind of that next area. I think this is the area that's caused the most amount of concern in the last few weeks / months that I've seen. I think there's been quite a lot of kind of online chats about this, a lot of chat forums around HMRC requesting repayments of previously paid out R&D claims.
Yeah.
So, and I think there was an article in the Sunday Times where there was I don't think it was the strongest argument. I think it was a dental practitioner who developed some bit of technology and had a repayment, and there was a request for a repayment, historical repayment there. So similar question to what I was asking before, but what's changed, and why are we seeing HMRC requesting kind of these repayments of previously paid out R&D claims?
Yeah, so I think probably a lot of people aren't aware that it's always been the case that even if they've paid out, they've still got that 2-year window in which to raise an inquiry if they wanted to. Now, historically, generally, if you go back before the last 18 months or so, if they paid out, it was almost unheard of that they'd raise an inquiry on it. So the rule there strictly hasn't changed, but obviously the way that they're applying it and using it has. Again, I'm seeing it more where they might raise an inquiry and then they might go and open the prior period and look at a couple of years in one go. And again, prior to 18 months, it was really rare you'd see that. There'll be times where you look at it and you think, well, they just know from the reports that have gone to them that the project in this period started in the prior period. And if they're questioning this one, common sense would say you'd probably question the other one, but they never typically did. So the behaviors have changed. And we're definitely seeing that much more. It's back to the fraud point, the error and fraud. And again, this is where the National Audit Office report from January is. I actually found it quite an interesting read, which probably tells you something about me. But it's back to that. It's back to this level of error and fraud that they think they found. They quote the 2020, 2021 tax year numbers because that's the period by which they got the full view on. Other periods they're still potentially getting some claims in for, where they said 25%, 1 billion of the 4 billion claimed in that year, error and fraud in it, which is staggering, right? And so National Audit Office themselves was saying to HMRC, well, it's not just all going to be in that year, is it? So you should be looking broader. So this is where some of it's come from, right? And if they're in theory recouping billions of pounds for the Exchequer, why would you stop? Now, usually, if they wanted to go back much further, they need grounds for discovery, right? And I think you and I have talked about this with some of the companies we've been talking with. They'd need grounds for discovery to go back even further, potentially challenge any repayments or any claims from earlier periods.
Yeah.
And the usual thinking is, and I've got to be honest, I haven't actually, thank God, had to deal with one of these. But the usual thinking would be, if you've done a report for your prior periods and hence disclosed to HMRC, what your claim is and the projects you've claimed and how you figured it out, that it's difficult for them to argue grounds for discovery, because it's like, well, you were given all this information, HMRC, when we made the claim 3, 4 years, 5 years ago. If you had any questions, you should have raised some questions then. So yeah, that's kind of some of the context of what sent some of the hairs running.
Well, let's just touch on that for a minute, because whilst HMRC don't have the opportunity to potentially go back more than 2 years, what I've seen on a number of instances on transactions that I've been involved in, where I've been acting for the acquirer, is actually presenting a challenge where we have, well, on a transaction, on the due diligence, we'll look at the 2 years, but if we think there's something fundamentally wrong in terms of the actual R&D being undertaken, now that might be a misclassification. We've seen a misclassification where it should have been RDEC as opposed to SME. We've seen stuff where fundamentally there was a position where there was just no R&D. Like, you guys looked at it, it was clearly a very speculative claim, and they'd been claiming it for years. So whilst agreed with Mark, it's, you know, can they go back more than 2 years? There's probably a level of uncertainty there. It's probably challenging for them to get into that detail. There is still a fear there that on a transaction, on a diligence, that individuals, that a diligence or a tricky diligence and might still pose it as a question. So, you know, and I've always said this whenever we've talked about it, like, from our perspective, like, we always look at and prepare R&D claims to a much higher standard, because we know that one of our clients, or all of our clients, are going to be inquired into at some point, and not inquired into by HMRC. They will be inquired into because of when all of our clients are going to go through a diligence, they're going to go through a liquidity event, a fundraise, and at some point some R&D professional is going to look at it and scrutinise in a lot more detail, and therefore there has to be a lot more rigour. There has to be a much more robust claim that sits behind it. That kind of takes us on quite nicely, sorry Mark, to kind of plot, like, literally, like, I'm leading you to the next point, which is, what can companies do to mitigate the chances of those kind of HMRC inquiries or requesting of repayments?
Yeah, well, I guess on your claims that have already gone in, there's not a huge amount you can do other than around probably making sure you've got any documentation that sits behind it and backs it up on file. You know, hopefully you've got a lot of good information around the projects claimed and why they're claimed, because I know, you know, people can move on from one company to another, you know, particularly with in a software space. You might have been using quite a lot of contractors that have got a good bit of knowledge in their head. So short of, for anything that's already gone in, short of that documentation and keeping good documentation, there's not too much else. But then at least you've perhaps got more information if HMRC did ask questions. I think for any claims you're working on or going in the future, it's back to those earlier points we talked about. I think so. It used to be the case that probably claimants could do their own claims. You know, if you go back 2-3 years and before, and you know, there's a number of our kind of wider Cooper Parry clients who did. I think it's so much harder these days, just again because so much is changing. Some of these rule changes, you know, and we haven't had a chance to go. There's so much. Some of them come in at different times depending on your year end relative to. You know, some changes come in for accounting periods starting after 1st of April last year, some from the 1st of April this year, some come in from expenditure incurred from certain dates, and then where your year sits relative to those. So it's just, there's so much moving at the moment. Anyone navigating themselves is tricky. So I mean, the key thing is get the advice you need so that you're following all you're following the new form and how to fill that out. You're following the guidelines from November. You know, there's things in between this, like HMRC coming out and saying in January, if you put a report on your tax return like we all used to do in the old days before the form came in, your claim will probably get reviewed a bit quicker. It's basically that there's information that they realise they could have done with on the form that's not yet captured on the form. So there's all the little nuances like this, even around some of the big information drops that have come in. You know, things we've picked up on some of the forums with them about their what's the word I'm looking for? They haven't reintroduced the de minimis. There used to be a de minimis on claims going back to 2012 that got scrapped. They were asked this question in the forum in December about are they reintroducing it and planning to, because there'd been some chat about it, and they said no. But they were basically saying, look, you know, any small claim, certainly anything getting in around £50,000 qualifying expenditure, would be highly dubious whether it's qualifying or not. It probably comes back to this, where they saw a lot of the fraud at the very small end of the SME regime. So it's just keeping. You need to make sure you're on top of it with what you need to follow for the given claim this year, and that is probably a bit different from what we might need to do next year with some of the changes that come in as well. Yeah, it's just a tricky landscape. It's making sure you've got a thorough claim, a good advisor, and good documentation backing it up.
Yeah, I had a client, a new client that recently came on board, and we looked at the prior year claims, and we said, look, and I think they'd been done in house or they'd been done by a boutique, right? And the question they asked is, should we? You know, and we looked at it, we said, look, it went back to that point that you mentioned earlier, which was the narratives have been written to such a high level, they hadn't got down into the granulars, they'd not looked at the technology really. It was as if like the CEO had drafted it, right? And that's not a slant on it, all CEOs, by the way. It's just me, it's just, I know it's a little bit tongue in cheek, but very commercially written, The question they asked was, should they resubmit their R&D claim, knowing that it wasn't to a standard that would be acceptable?
Right.
And it was a really interesting question. It was like, would you actually go and put, because that's almost like raising the red flag to the bull, right? And I think where we landed on that one was, look, we looked at it, we said it wasn't good enough, but that's what you've gone and submitted, okay? And I think what you probably want to do is pull together almost a defence paper in the event that HMRC were ever to kind of raise that inquiry.
Yeah.
Don't go and resubmit. I think that's at this point in time, you're only going to create an issue for yourself, and a historical issue as well. So it was an interesting conversation and debate to be had. But yeah, I think the conclusion was don't go and do it, because you're only going to raise concerns. And you raised a really good point, right? This was the issue that we had on one of the diligences, where we needed to test the validity of the R&D claim for even 3 or 4 years ago. And the issue that you quite often face then is that if you're in a position there and the CTO's changed and your lead engineers have changed, how do you go back and verify the information? Who's there? There's like a knowledge gap at that point. And frankly, if you're in a position where you can't confirm, you just don't have the information at your fingertips, you can't confirm those points. So it's just going to fall flat, right?
It is. You can look at the, for years and years and years, the messaging in the market from a lot of advisors was always like, we'll help you maximize your claim. We'll find more than anyone else has found, right? You look how the marketing messages have changed, right? Now it's all about risk. You don't hear anyone shouting about, we'll maximize your claim, we'll find you more than anyone else, etc., which tells you how much things have shifted in the last 12, 18 months. But you just got to be on top of the rules and the latest changes. You follow that, you'll be all right. But I think it's an acceptance of what you put in last year. This year will probably look a bit different and might be a bit narrower depending on what you've been doing in the business. Yeah.
Right. Let's move on to that final topic, unless anyone's got any other questions. I don't think there's any other questions in the chat bar that's come up. No. Just a quick recap on the upcoming or future changes that we're expecting to see. So what future changes do companies need to be aware of, and when are they likely to come into effect?
Yeah, so this kind of going back to last year, there was talk of merging the regimes. There was talk of, even going back before that, about scrapping the SME regime, which actually, when you stop and think about it, it's basically what HMRC have done. All right, they've in essence scrapped the SME. They're talking about the merged regime, and it was so interesting. Oh God, which release was it? I think it was the release the other day about subcontract rules. I was reading. I called this back last year that they started talking about, we're merging the regimes, right? We're going to merge SME and RDEC. This is under the banner of simplifying the R&D tax regimes. And I'll go through some of the key features of that merged regime and how different it looks. But in essence, and I'm probably being a little facetious, but in essence, they basically scrapped the SME regime, right? And everyone's moving to claim under the RDEC regime. There's some differences with what this new RDEC regime will look like compared to the old one. But by and large, most of it's the existing RDEC regime. So when they say they've scrapped the SME regime, the merger regimes, they've really scrapped the SME regime. And this links back, without getting back into more of the history, this links back to when Rishi was Chancellor, and there was a lot of chat, even in the Commons, about, are the R&D regimes fit for purpose? The SME regime supposedly wasn't incentivizing private investment in R&D at the levels the government wanted, and all this kind of stuff. So anyway, but that's more of the history. But yeah, so this is where we got to. So this was in the autumn statement, and basically came into play from the 1st of April this month. So this won't be hitting anyone right now, because the first claimants it already hit is your March 25 year ends. But basically, for any accounting period starting on or after the 1st of April this year, we're now into the merge regime, as they're calling it, which basically means it's the RDEC regime with some differences. So if you've been an SME for years, used to claiming, and you would have got your 130% additional deduction that was then down to 86% from the 1st of April last year, and even changes in the loss surrender rate, notwithstanding the R&D intensity regime, the intensive regime, what I'll touch on in a minute. But basically, everyone's under the RDEC regime now, which means you get the 20% above the line credit. It doesn't work like the additional tax deduction. You got the 20% above the line credit booked in the accounts akin to grant income or something like that. That's taxable, and then you end up with a net benefit of around 15%, basically. So anyone who used to going to getting 33% in the old days, or 25%, which is now more like 20%. When we're into the new regime, you're more at 15%. There's some variation on that I'll come to. So that's in. And I mean, this is where some of the earlier points around modernising the regimes comes in, because we haven't even touched on the introduction of the cloud and data and qualifying maths costs that came in from 1st of April last year. So that's continuing. That's continuing under the new merged regime, which was one of the key modernisation things, right? The cloud should have been in years ago, right? Like how many people on this call are developing an IT platform where they bought the servers themselves and are sitting them in some back room? Like, everyone's been in the cloud for donkey's years, right? Doing development. So anyway, that's some of the good modernization stuff. I mean, obviously, going from April last year, they put the rates up for the large companies for the RDEC regime, so that was a good thing. Didn't help the SMEs, but help the large companies. They're by and large porting over the subcontract rules from the SME regime to the RDEC regime. So currently under RDEC, you can't claim subcontracted R&D apart from some exceptions. They're by and large putting in the SME subcontract rule, so you can claim subcontract. And there was a bunch of guidance they released just a few weeks ago going into that, because it raised a lot of questions about how that's going to work when everyone's under allowed to claim subcontract as opposed to just SMEs historically. A lot of the rules around subsidized R&D, so the impact of grants and things like that on your R&D claim, that typically in the past meant you would have claimed under RDEC instead of SME if it was grant funded. Those rules are gone, because it's all about the notified state aid status and things like that. So that's gone under the new merged regime. We have got the overseas restrictions coming in. So again, this was originally going to come in last year. They pushed it back to 1st of April and onwards this year. And again, there was a raft of guidance just the other week released around this, and a bunch of examples, like 14 different examples around what you can claim in terms of people being overseas. So they've been really, really clear. This is just around really EPWs and subcontractors. It's not staff, as long as we're talking about staff of the UK, people on PAYE, NIC, employed in the UK. It's not to do with consumables or software licenses or anything like that. But there is this restriction coming in on overseas. Again, there's some exceptions, and this is where some of these examples come into play, but there's 14 of them. There's quite a lot to cover. But it's just worth being aware of that. Again, particularly for tech companies, if you've got offshore development teams, how's that going to impact your claim? So that needs considering. Yeah, it's worth just touching on the SME intensive scheme, which came in for expenditure incurred after the 1st of April last year. So some people now might have started utilizing this, but that's continuing in the merged regime, or what they're just going to start calling it the RDEC regime, because it pretty much is the RDEC regime. So again, this simply applies for loss-making SMEs, and basically gives you a way to get a better credit payment, get a credit payment rate out. So they're going to allow you to surrender the losses 86%, 186% at the 14.5% loss surrender rate, like it used to be. This is where you get lost in endless percentages, and this is where even now these days I've got to write it down because so many different permutations at different points. So that's there to kind of help, I guess, particularly tech as well. But to qualify on that, you've got to, for last year it was introduced where you've got to have at least 40% of your company expenditure is on R&D. So you can see it's focused on tech startups and a few others, but mainly tech startups. They brought that down to 30% from 1st of April this year.
Yeah.
So again, it's just another simplifying the regimes, right? It's just another permutation, another thing, another if this then this. Yeah, but it's there. It's their way. If you really step back there, what I think it is that the tax framework, it's not that agile, right? And so what they really wanted to do there was help tech startups. and scaling companies. But there's nothing in the tax framework that kind of easily enables them to do that. So they've put this metric in. It is broader than just tech, but I think that's where that's kind of come into play.
Can we just delve into that for a second? So 30% of what, all costs?
Yeah, total company expenditure. So it's yeah. Yeah, I know. I've got to be honest. I think we literally just have our kind of first few clients, because this only the legislation only got royal assent quite recently. So it was a weird one where they're so desperate to bring it in, they announced it, but actually no one could actually officially claim for it for a while. But it's now gone through royal assent. The legislation's in play, and so it's only just now we're starting to look at this and get into the nuances of what that properly means. But yeah, it's there.
It's another test. So whilst we're trying to simplify, it's another test. It's another boundary that you've got to go over to ensure that you fall within that before you do anything else.
Yeah, it was, HMRC, there was some language around, we're simplifying the regimes. We're going from an SME and RDEC to one regime, which they have, but then you've still got this SME intensity metric thing and some slightly different rates that sits on the side of it. And then you've got all this other change going on that we're talking about. So yeah.
Not the easiest. Yeah. Okay, so if your head's not spinning enough, like, there's a lot of change, and this reference to simplification just seems to be almost a bit of spin doctory to basically say it's not as simple as it's going to be. So how can companies prepare for these kind of upcoming changes? What's the best thing they can think about, and how to address it?
Either you got to go and read all the guidance and everything yourself and all the other info that's dropped, which is a lot, or you need I think it's one of these areas you just need advice these days. It goes back to that point. I think for a number of years you probably could navigate things yourself, and what the claim you did last year, the blueprint probably largely applied to the next year, and that was the case for a number of years. It's just too fast moving at the moment. I think it will slow down. I think there's additional information form coming in, this guidance coming in. I think we are into a regime where there would be more frequent guidance updates from HMRC, and again links back to that expert advisory committee point. And this is why I think that has fundamentally changed. I don't think we're going to go back to this. Some people keep thinking, oh, this is just some blip and we're going to go back to some slightly more static state. Volume inquiries will go down. We won't see we won't see fundamental changes like getting rid of the SME regime and stuff like that. But I think we're going to see much more frequent guidance updates and things like that with HMRC, and changes where they're needed to keep the regimes modern and fit for purpose. But I think it is generally just going to be a much more dynamic landscape. But there's just so much change in the here and now.
Yeah.
I'm aware of the obvious bias in sitting here as an R&D tax advisor and saying this, but I just don't see how otherwise you can navigate all this at the moment without getting good advice.
Yeah, agreed. But hopefully, listening to what you're saying, it's like that old analogy of like, we've been through the worst of the storm. Hopefully, it's almost like, there was such a knee-jerk reaction by HMRC in terms of the approach when they realized just how much money they were fundamentally giving away. Like, it was such a knee-jerk reaction, and they reacted to it so strongly and that's why we saw the increase in the number of inquiries, we saw the increase in the number of requests for repayments, we saw very specific questioning in like segmented areas within technology. Now, that's not to say, like, look, and again, I'm using Chris's phrase of the doom and gloom, like, there will still be instances where genuine R&D is not being undertaken, and HMRC will still be pursuing that. But for companies that are genuinely claiming R&D and working to build businesses and develop IP here in the UK, that's what the R&D regime is here to support and substantiate. So that will continue. So hopefully it's been a blip, and hopefully we can get ourselves back on track. I'm going to open up the floor to kind of questions. Alison's put one in the chat already, and I think you've touched on this already. So so she said, we have an Innovation UK grant for a project we're working on in conjunction with other partners. How do the rules work with this? They're currently an SME.
I think it's usually worth starting with what is the grant for, specifically what's it paying for, and how does that sort of contractually work between Alison's company and the partners they're working with. I think you got to start there and then understand if, I presume it is, well, it depends. Innovate UK grants can be pretty broad, but if it's then subsidising R&D, the R&D effort, if the project's basically paid for by the grant, yeah, then it's probably, you'd have to understand the specifics, but you're probably looking at the expenditure you've incurred as a business doing the R&D. You also need to make sure that meets the R&D tax definition, and then understanding how much of that has been basically paid for by the grant, and then that will help you figure out what you should be claiming potentially under RDEC as opposed to SME. Simply put, there's a few things to navigate there to get the specifics of it. But I think that's the way I'd come at it.
Is there a world in which, if you still claim grant, but you qualified for the kind of 30% benefit? Sorry, I've gone into a totally technical question. Like, could you qualify for both? Could you then get like the new merged or the RDEC? Like, because before you'd have got the RDEC regime and the SME.
Oh, you mean in the new merged world?
Yeah, in the new merged world.
That's a good question. I'm not sure. Yeah, so everyone's in there. Yeah. Okay. All
right, I'm not going to put it on the spot like that. That's one for us to look at in a bit more detail.
No, it's a good one. It's a good one. So can you benefit from the beneficial rate, the SME intensity rate?
Because that was always blocked because of the state aid point, wasn't it? So it depends if it's state aid funded.
I need to check that one. I'm not sure.
Perfect. Does anyone else? Is there any other questions from anyone else? Does anyone feel like they're going to be particularly brave and come on camera and ask any questions, or is there any clarification of any of the points that we touched on today that anyone wants a bit more on?
They're probably all gone for lunch.
I might ask a quick question, if that's all right.
Yes, of course. Shoot.
It should be an easy one. Am I right in saying that if you are offshoring your R&D mainly from a cost perspective, it's very unlikely that you'll ever find anything to help you from an HMRC R&D perspective?
Yeah, and you're saying, Adam, under the merge regime that's coming and those restrictions on overseas. Yeah. Yes, simply put, HMRC have been pretty clear that if it's cost driven, then you're unlikely to get any exemption. It's in I think it was 14. The 14 examples they've given in the documentation that released a couple of weeks back. They're actually quite useful examples. Like often I find, I don't want to bash HMRC, but often some of the examples they give are kind of like, well, no one's ever going to be doing. I think some of the original examples that came out when they started floating this last year was around if you're doing deep sea research and you can't do that in UK waters and you're off in the Mariana Trench or something. Like, yeah, that'll be an exception. And you're like, well, how many UK climate companies are going to? There'll be some, right? But who's going to be off in the, deep sea research out of UK waters and stuff? So but actually, in all fairness, some of the examples that were in the recent guidance were actually quite useful, and around some of the exemptions. But yeah, they're still kind of clear that cost isn't one of them.
We had one interesting one the other day, Mark, that came up, which was for a very niche and specific area of data scientists, where they fundamentally said that actually they'd already hired everyone in the UK that was a specialist in this field.
Okay.
And so what they then had to do is that basically they'd hired everyone, so then they had to go to the US, and there was a couple of specific universities which were looking at this very specific area of data science, and as a result, they thought that there was a possibility for them to maybe include that overseas expenditure, because they'd looked at the UK. There was just no one else they could actually physically hire that was in the UK.
There was no one with the skill set.
Yeah,
that's an interesting one. I think in one of the recent examples they gave that they said they'd accept that. Yeah. I think this is the key point, isn't it? That we're in new territory with this. There's other regimes around the world that have similar restrictions. Australia did for many years. I don't know if they still do, but yeah, it is kind of new territory, and the examples are very useful, seeing how it plays out in practice. And and again, in all fairness, HMRC, it's a bit of a learning thing for them. Do they end up with a load of claims where people are finding all sorts of inventive ways to circumnavigate that, and then they're like, actually, okay, we need to change the guidance or hone it in or something. It'll take a good 12 months or more to really see how that plays out. But credit to them, they seem to have listened to a lot of the feedback that came in the consultation and have tried to put some extra guidance in around it.
We've probably got just enough time for one more question if anyone's feeling brave to jump in and ask that question. Any takers?
Happy to go again.
Always, Adam.
Go for it.
If you're in a scenario where you've stopped submitting R&D claims and are now going to restart again, do you think there's anything extra you need to be sort of aware of? Obviously, you'd have to be a little bit more careful, because you'd imagine it'd flag up on their screen, like, oh, this company submitted 3 years ago, then stopped, it's now starting again.
Yeah, I think it's worth in your report, when you do one, it's worth setting a bit of context as to why. Because you're right, it's an obvious question, isn't it? Oh, why did they stop? And it could be a number of good reasons, right? Why did they stop and not claim for a while, and now they've restarted? So I think if you give them that high level context, that can't hurt. I mean, on this point, one of the other many changes we haven't managed to touch on was around the pre-notification rule that's come in. And so this, again, I think the context here was, I think a good amount of the fraudulent claims HMRC had seen were from first-time claimants, because they're probably from people who like pubs and people who should never have been claiming, and then some unscrupulous advisor had advised them and convinced them to claim. So anyway, I think that's why it came in. But that pre-notifications, it's for accounting periods starting on or after 1st of April last year. If you haven't claimed in the last 3 years, you have to fill in this notification form to notify them that you are going to claim, and you need to do that within 6 months of the end of the accounting period for which you're claiming. So first periods really that this starts impacting is your March 24s unless you've got short periods or something. March 24s. So if you've got a March 24 and you haven't claimed before, or you haven't claimed in the last 3 years, you want to stick in this pre-notification form, and you need to do that before the end of September. And then you've still got the 2-year window in which to claim. If you don't put that in before the end of September, within 6 months, then you basically lose the 2-year window. So that's another thing that's come in.
Niche point, okay. Mark, love that.
Yeah, that's useful. So if you haven't claimed in 21, 22 or 23, then we need to do a notification if we're going to claim. I'm in the wrong year. 20, 21, 22. I have to do it by soon if we're going to claim for 23.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I got to be honest, again, I haven't had a client where we've had to do this yet, actually, because a lot of our clients are ones that have been claiming for many years. But yeah, it's worth being aware of that. It is a bit of an odd one, because you would have thought if they're getting if they're reviewing claims properly and they've got more inspectors and they've got the additional information forms, so they're mandatory now, you've got to give them a load of information about the claim and all the other stuff. You would have thought, isn't that enough to make sure we're weeding out anyone who shouldn't be claiming? The pre-notification thing's I always found a bit of an odd one.
And if you want to pick that up separately, just let me know.
Cool, thanks.
All right, well, we're up against time. Thank you everyone for joining today. Really appreciate it. If you've got any questions, just fire Mark and myself a note, and then we can take it from there. But hopefully there was some really, Mark, thank you so much, really insightful.
No, you're welcome.
And thank you so much for sharing some of your valuable insights. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much. Bye everyone for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.